This is the Tom Bigby Tales, and I'm your host, Shannon Evans. I write about a small town in northeast Mississippi called Columbus, and sometimes I write about the rest of the state. This episode is episode 12 in my Columbus Housing Authority exploration called Columbus Community Housing Development Organization and Columbus Housing Authority Financial Red Flags. In these accounting shadows, we're going to unravel the financial irregularities in this community housing organization. Let's deep dive into the financial transparency or lack thereof and the organizational accountability that is missing at the Columbus Housing Authority and its associated group, which they call Columbus Community Housing Development Organization, or what I will be referring to as CHDO from now on. Let's have a look at the financial landscape. First, we're going to look at CHDO because it has multiple bank accounts across very different institutions. It has significant unexplained money movement both into and out of the organization and is lacking very basic accounting documentation in the reports that the Executive Director, Robert Graythry, who is also the Executive Director of the Columbus Housing Authority, is responsible for delivering in their meeting board packets. In October of 2023, which is the earliest board minutes that I have, the CHDO organization had $40,875 in their Citizens Bank account. And then by December of 2023, $35,000 of it was gone, but there's no explanation provided for where this money went or how it was spent. There's no supporting documentation. There's no board approval of transfer of the content. It's just totally unaccounted for. It's very curious to me. This is the kind of stuff that I wanted to have a look at. But let's talk about how this nonprofit fits into the Columbus Housing Authority. The Columbus Housing Authority has a board of commissioners. They are Kedra Gray, who I believe is the president, Martin Andrews, Greta Gardner, Bo Harrison, and Worley Bird. Now, when I'm looking at meeting minute for the Columbus Housing Authority, they get a ledger input that is just a snapshot of the accounts that the Columbus Housing Authority has, and then there's a snapshot of what's with the nonprofit CHDO. Now, why is this Board of Commissioners looking at both accounts? These same people are the board of both entities. So Gray, Andrews, Gardner, Harrison, and Bird all sit on both the Columbus Housing Authority's board and CHDO. And you'll see that in their meeting minutes, they'll have a discussion where they'll have on their Columbus Housing Authority hats, and then they'll say, okay, now we're going to look at this as the CHDO board, and then they'll approve the minutes or not approve the minutes, or they'll have some input, and then they'll go right back to having their Columbus Housing Authority hats on. When I'm looking at the nonprofit part in the meeting minutes, two things stand out. There's a lot of money that moves through their checking accounts, and the board that oversee it never sees any of the invoices, no purchase orders, or reports on where the money is spent. They always just approve these financials with the approval of the overall meeting minutes for the CHA, and they never ask why tens of thousands are spent some months and where the money in the checking accounts or the investment accounts goes, much less how it is spent. So let's look at it this way. For instance, I mentioned before that in October of 2023, there was over $40,000 in the Citizens Bank investment account. But by December, $35,000 was gone from the investment account. Why? It doesn't show that it's reflected in the checking account. I have so many accounting questions, and I have yet to see a check or invoice from CHDO, although I have gone online and looked at some of their 990s, but that's something we'll talk about another day, is the 990s and what they reveal. But just keep in mind that Gray, Andrews, Gardner, Harrison, and Bird are over both CHDO's board and their spending and the Columbus Housing Authority's board and their spending. And per the 990s of CHDO, the nonprofit, the executive director of Columbus Housing Authority is also the director of CHDO and gets paid over $90,000 a year just for that position, independent of his pay at the Columbus Housing Authority. I find this all very interesting. So I look at the general accounting of the checking. Let's just look at the checking account. In December of 2023, the primary checking account has $23,225.21 in it. In December, it has $32,000 in it. Now, I then jump ahead to April of 2024, and suddenly they've gone from $32,000 in their Bank First checking account to $106,978.82. Now, where did that money come from? Was it a grant? Was it money from the Columbus Housing Authority? We don't know, because there's no indication of where that money came from or how it got there. That was April. By May, they have spent that $106,000 down to $85,000, but again, we have no idea where that money is, how it was spent. We don't know what it's doing or why. Then in June, it's down to $65,000. So they've spent $20,000 and we don't know where it went or why. I presume it was to pay expenses, but who knows? But the next month, they've spent almost $30,000 because their checking account goes from $65,000 in June to $39,000 in July. And then in August, they've spent $33,000 because all they have left now is $6,000 in that Bank First checking account. Now, in September, they get a $50,000 or so because the account goes from $6,000 to $54,000. I believe they got that money from the Housing Authority. But why are they just moving money around? Why do they just give them $50,000? How is that coded? I'm sure Rusty could tell us how, since he's famous for knowing how to code things. So HUD will cover expenses. So then the next month, that's September, October, they've now gone from $54,729 in their Bank First checking account to $140,000 in their bank account. So the up and down motion of this bank account is very interesting. And then in November, they've gone from $140,000 to $112,000. And then by Christmas, they've gone from $112,000 in November to $87,000 in December. That's all 2024. And then January of 2025, the Bank First checking account has gone from $87,000 to $6,000. So that's an interesting number. And then in February, it's gone up to $22,000 in the checking account. And then in March, it jumps from $22,000 to $103,981.12. So that's an $80,000 jump. So where did that money come from? These are all just crazy numbers for a board to just meet and sign, and there's no discussion. There's nothing in the meeting minutes that says where the money went. Did anyone even ask? There's no comparison. They don't know what was spent the month before, unless maybe they had their former meeting minutes with them. There's just so many questions about the accounting practices. But let's get back to the Columbus Housing Authority bookkeeping. I have the financials there, and I have the bank statements, and I have the fronts of each check written between October 2023 and April 2025. So what is notable is what is missing from 98% of those checks. There are no invoice numbers or purchase order numbers, and absolutely no contract numbers associated on any of those checks. So how do they and the vendors reconcile the checks to their outstanding bills? These are just basic accounting practices, and that is a heartburn for me, which leads me to the most egregious issue of the checking account are the violations of their own two-party signature policy. In other words, their organization requires two signatures for all their checks. Yet, on March 28, 2024, check number 44028 to the Mississippi Tax Office has but one signature. Now, if you could even call it that, it is initialed, and it's not even clear. I think it says GL, but I am not sure. Then check number 43967, dated a month later on April 30th, 2024, has one signature. Then on check 44, 181, 82, 83, and about 100 more checks, there's only one or two sets of initials. So it might be signed by one person, and then there's a set of initials for the second person who's supposed to sign. But the interesting thing is the handwriting looks almost identical on both signatures. So Is that just coincidence, or is somebody initialing the checks for others? I find that very interesting. Then there are about 10 to 15 checks that are clearly rubber stamp signatures by Miss Greta Gardner. Well, which leads back to my previous episode about why she's an absentee member of this board of commissioners who has an awful lot of sway in what goes on there, and her name's on an awful lot of documents, but yet I'm not really sure why they have a rubber stamp for her signature, other than I hear she's not in great health, so I'm guessing she doesn't come in, but I don't think it's legal to let somebody rubber stamp your signature. It's at least unethical. So now, let's look at some really red flags for me. First, there's the organization's director, who simultaneously leads Columbus Housing Authority in Choteau and receives a salary according to their 990s and the Columbus Housing Authority's internal documents, that he receives 2 salaries, one from each site. It seems like there are a lot of potential conflicts of interest connected to both of these things. And then there's the accounting malpractices. 98% of the checks lack, I would say 99%, lack invoice numbers. I only found 2 or 3 that had some sort of numbers on them that I presume are purchase order numbers. Can't prove it because it doesn't say PO number, blah, blah, blah. It just has 2 sets of numbers on it. Anyways, there are no invoice numbers, no purchase order references, no contract identifiers. That is a big no-no in accounting. Another one is the requirement of the 2-party check signatures, as mentioned above, and where there are numerous instances of single signatures, initial checks, and of course the rubber stamped signature. Which leads me to some issues. Does Robert Guthrie, who's doing the accounting, actually have this accounting degree he purports to have from the University of Southern Mississippi? For someone who serves in such an important position and is doing the accounting and making so many egregious errors and serving as the comptroller and the executive director of 2 organizations side by side, that accounting degree is critical to his credentials. So if he doesn't have them, then I have some bigger. These are some very questionable financial management practices that he's initiating, not to mention the others that I've uncovered previously. The $50,000 he spent on travel in 12 months, it's actually over $50,000. The poorly maintained financial ledgers, and these inconsistent accounting practices. I do believe this is all extraordinarily bad practice and possibly in non-compliance with state and national HUD guidelines. The initials on these checks appear to be RG for Robert Guthrie, who I can find multiple checks that he has actually signed with his full signature, and the other appears to be GL for Greg Lewis, and there's another one that I'm not really sure. It could be MA. It could be something else. But Greg Lewis was on the board. He's no longer on the board because he was a city employee, and there was a conflict of interest of having a city employee sitting on the Board of Commissioners for the Columbus Housing Authority. There are others as well as far as the initials. We can go into that later, or maybe they need to at their own board meeting. Robert Guthrie is in charge of the accounting as the comptroller and the executive director of both institutions. He does allegedly have this accounting degree from the University of Southern Mississippi, but these behaviors and others that I've discussed in those previous episodes, with the lack of financial oversight, the egregious amounts spent on travel, I just said over $50,000 in the last 12 months, the poorly labeled ledgers, and the missteps with the truck scam and the checks before and after the truck scam was identified, where they sent a second check after that to Nancy Thomas before they had to cancel it when they realized they'd made a mistake just a couple of weeks ago, all has me curious. Does Robert actually have a BS in accounting as he claims? Because believe me, folks, the math ain't mathing. So let's talk about some of the potential implications of what I think is going on. There's all kinds of breach of organizational policies. I think there's some potential violations of HUD guidelines, and there's definitely an abomination in accounting standards. Here's what I recommend. They need an independent financial audit. Someone who's not connected to them, nobody who's connected to old Rusty. It needs to be totally independent. They need a review of their board governance, and they need a comprehensive financial review of their institutions, both of them, and they need to verify their leadership's credentials. This case underscores the critical importance of financial transparency, robust governance, and accountability in nonprofit organizations and organizations that are connected to our state, local, or national government. When financial oversight fails, it puts our community resources and our community's trust at risk. Financial transparency isn't just about numbers. It's about maintaining the sacred trust between community organizations and the people they serve. This is not their money. This is not Mr. Grathrie's money, and this is definitely not Rusty Walker's money. This is our money. These are our tax dollars that we are asking these people in this organization to use in the way that it has been designated to serve the underprivileged in our community. Look, I'm presenting these findings based on available documentation. All these parties mentioned above have the right to provide additional context or clarify. If they would like to come on this podcast and speak their part, they are welcome to come on board. I'd love to hear from the board members. I'd love to hear from Mr. Gray. I'm going to ask you, my listeners, to stay vigilant, ask questions, and demand transparency. Because darn it, at the end of the day, this is our money. I want to thank you for coming on my podcast, The Tom Bigby Tales. Until next time.